The lamplight flickered against the whitewashed walls of Redemption Ridge's community hall on that warm spring evening in 1882, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock Margaret Louise Hewitt as she pressed her back against the rough-hewn timber. The fiddles had already started their third reel, and Maggie's hands smoothed down the faded blue calico dress for what must have been the 100th time that night, as if the gesture could somehow transform the worn fabric into something that might catch a young man's eye. It couldn't, of course, and deep in her heart, she'd known that before she'd even climbed into her father's wagon for the ride into town. 22 years was a long time to learn the particular sting of invisibility, and Maggie had become something of an expert in the art of making herself small at these social gatherings. She'd positioned herself in the back corner, near the refreshment table, but not so close as to seem presumptuous, where she could watch the swirl of skirts and the flash of boot heels without being obviously alone. The other young women of Redemption Ridge had clustered near the front of the hall, their dresses in cheerful yellows and pinks, their hair curled and pinned with ribbons that Maggie's family couldn't afford. They giggled behind their hands and cast meaningful glances at the young men who lined the opposite wall. Was that age-old dance of courtship playing out exactly as it always did. Maggie knew every step of that dance by heart, though she'd never been asked to perform it. She'd watched it at the Autumn Harvest Festival, at the Christmas Social, at the spring gatherings for the past 6 years since she'd turned 16, and her mother had declared her old enough to attend. Each time, the hope that had bloomed in her chest at the beginning of the evening had withered a little more by the end. Until now, it barely stirred at all. She told herself it was contentment, this resignation she felt. She told herself it was maturity, accepting God's plan for her life. But on nights like this, when the music swelled and the laughter rang out and pair after pair joined the dancing, it felt an awful lot like loneliness. The mayor's daughter, a vivacious girl named Lucinda, with honey-colored curls and a dress the color of spring roses, was dancing for the third time with Colt Henderson, and Maggie found herself watching them with an emotion she wasn't proud of. Colt was the foreman at the Triple Crown Ranch, the most prosperous spread in 3 counties, and he cut a fine figure in his pressed Sunday shirt and polished boots. He was everything the frontier novels in the mercantile window promised a Western man should be: tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile and confident manner that suggested he'd never doubted his place in the world. When he laughed at something Lucinda said, the sound carried across the hall, and several other young women turned to look with barely concealed envy. Maggie didn't envy Lucinda the attention, not exactly. She'd long since accepted that girls like her, girls with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, girls whose dresses had been let out twice and still showed the original hemlines, girls who smelled more of lye soap than lavender water, were not the kind that men like Colt Henderson noticed. What she envied was the ease of it all, the simple certainty in Lucinda's laugh that she was exactly where she belonged, dancing in the arms of a handsome man who'd chosen her from all the others. The fiddles wound down, and Maggie watched as the dancers applauded and then reformed for the next set. Young Timothy Walsh, the banker's nephew visiting from Cheyenne, approached the merchant's eldest daughter. James Pritchard, whose father owned the livery, bowed slightly to ask Rebecca Stone, and the schoolteacher's younger sister, for her hand. Even awkward Peter Simmons, who could barely string 2 words together in normal conversation, managed to approach one of the newer settlers' daughters with a stammered request that was accepted with a kind smile. But no one approached Maggie. No one even glanced in her direction. She might as well have been part of the wall itself, just another piece of the rough timber and whitewash that made up the hall. She'd become so good at this invisibility that she wondered sometimes if she was actually fading, if one day she might disappear entirely and no one would notice she was gone. She was reaching for a cup of punch, more for something to do with her hands than from any real thirst when she felt it. That peculiar prickling sensation at the back of her neck that meant someone was watching her. Maggie froze, her hand hovering over the ladle, her heart suddenly beating faster. Slowly, trying not to appear too eager, she glanced around the room, searching for the source of that attention. But everyone seemed occupied with their own conversations, their own interests. The young men were all focused on the young women they were courting or hoping to court. The married couples were clustered in groups, discussing crops and weather and children. The older women supervised the refreshment table with eagle eyes, making sure decorum was maintained. Maggie told herself she'd imagined it, that sensation of being seen. It wouldn't be the first time she'd conjured hope from nothing after all. She filled her cup with punch that tasted faintly of canned peaches and too much sugar, and returned to her spot against the wall, taking small sips and trying to look content rather than abandoned. What Maggie couldn't know from her position in the back corner, was that she hadn't imagined anything at all. In the doorway leading to the front porch, half hidden by the shadow of the door frame, Josiah Blackwood had indeed been watching her, and he'd been watching her all night. Joe, as everyone called him, wasn't the kind of man who drew attention in a crowd. At 28, he'd learned to move quietly through the world, to take up as little space as possible, to avoid notice. It was a skill he'd developed over years of necessity. Ever since the accident when he was 14, that had left his right leg twisted and shortened, giving him a pronounced limp that no amount of determination could disguise. He'd been working his father's ranch, helping to break a particularly stubborn Mustang, when the horse had reared and come down hard, catching Joe's leg between its weight and a fence post. The leg had healed after a fashion, but it had healed wrong. And the Joe who'd emerged from that injury was a different person than the boy who'd gone into it. That boy had been confident, easy with people, quick to laugh. The man who stood in the doorway now was quiet, watchful, more comfortable with horses than humans. He worked as a ranch hand, moving from spread to spread as the work required, never staying long enough to put down roots. He lived in bunkhouses and line shacks, owned little more than what could fit in his saddlebags, and had long since accepted that some men were meant to walk through life alone. But tonight, something had drawn him to this social gathering in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd been working at the Patterson spread for the past 2 months, mending fences and helping with the spring branding, and when the other hands had decided to come into town for the dance, he'd found himself tagging along despite his usual reluctance. He'd told himself he'd just stay for an hour, maybe less, on just long enough to be sociable. He'd positioned himself by the door so he could slip out without causing comment. And then he'd seen Maggie Hewitt standing against the back wall in her faded dress, and something in his chest had twisted in a way that had nothing to do with old injuries. Joe had noticed her before, of course. Redemption Ridge wasn't so large that you didn't eventually see most everyone in town, and he'd seen Maggie at church services and at the Mercantile, on always with her family, always with that quiet dignity that seemed so at odds with her worn clothing and work-roughened hands. He'd never spoken to her. What would a man like him have to say to any young woman? But he'd observed her in the way he observed most things, quietly and from a distance. Tonight, though, watching her stand alone while everyone else paired off and danced, watching the way she held herself so carefully still as if trying not to take up too much room in the world, and watching the brief flash of something that might have been longing cross her face before she schooled it back to calm acceptance. Tonight, Joe saw something in Maggie Hewitt that resonated in his very bones. He saw someone who knew what it was like to be overlooked, passed by, deemed not quite enough. He saw someone who'd learned to carry rejection with grace, who'd taught herself to find contentment in the margins. He saw himself, reflected back in the eyes of a woman in a faded blue dress. And the recognition was immediate and visceral, and with it came an urge so strong it nearly propelled him across the room before his rational mind could intervene. He wanted to ask her to dance. He wanted to cross that floor, limp and all, and offer his hand and invite her to join him in the simple pleasure of moving to music. He wanted to see what she looked like when someone finally noticed her, when someone finally chose her from all the others. But Joe's courage, which had never fully recovered from his injury, failed him before he'd taken 2 steps. Old memories rose up to stop him, as they always did. Memories of Penelope Marsh, the girl he'd been engaged to before the accident, the girl who'd broken their engagement 6 months after his injury, when a wealthier, whole-bodied suitor had come to town. He could still hear her words, spoken in the parlor of her father's house with a cruelty that had surprised him more than the rejection itself. "I can't marry a cripple, Joe. Surely you understand that. I need a man who can provide properly, who can walk into a room without people staring and pitying. I deserve better than a life of hardship and embarrassment." The words had carved themselves into his soul, a scar deeper than any physical injury. They'd shaped the years that followed, had informed every interaction he'd had with every person since. They'd taught him that some people were meant to be chosen, and some people were meant to watch from the doorway. They'd taught him that hope was a dangerous thing for men like him, that it was better to accept your lot and find what peace you could in solitude and hard work. So Joe stayed in the doorway, watching Maggie Hewitt and wrestling with the war between desire and self-protection that raged in his chest. The fiddles played, and the dancers whirled, and Maggie stood alone, and Joe remained frozen between the wanting and the fearing. He told himself he was being wise, practical. What woman would want to dance with a man who could barely walk properly? What woman would want the attention of someone who owned nothing but a horse and a well-worn Bible? What woman would choose him when there were whole, prosperous men available? But wisdom and practicality couldn't entirely silence the voice in his head that whispered different words. Words he'd read in Scripture just that morning during his devotions. Words about how man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Words about how the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Words about how God uses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and the weak things to shame the strong. Joe had built his faith on those words over the years, had clung to them during the long, lonely nights when the ache in his leg was matched only by the ache in his heart. He believed them, truly believed them. He believed that God saw him, knew him, valued him even when the world didn't. But believing God could love a broken man and believing a woman could were two very different things, and the gap between them seemed as wide as the Wyoming plains. The evening wore on, and Joe remained in his doorway, and Maggie remained against her wall, and neither of them moved toward the other. The music swelled and faded and swelled again. Couples formed and reformed. Laughter rang out, unpunctuated by the stomp of boots and the swish of skirts. The lamplight flickered, casting those mocking shadows that seemed to emphasize every empty space, every person standing alone. Maggie had just decided she'd stayed long enough to avoid causing comment and was considering making her excuses to leave when her youngest sister Abigail came running up, her 8-year-old face flushed with excitement from dancing with their brother Benjamin. The little girl grabbed Maggie's hand and tugged, trying to pull her toward where the children were gathered for a group dance. "Come on, Maggie. Come dance with us. Benjamin says you know all the steps and can teach the little ones." For just a moment, Maggie's careful composure cracked, and something raw and painful flashed across her face, the reality that she was reduced to dancing with children because no man would ask her. But she recovered quickly, and smoothing Abigail's hair back from her damp forehead with a tenderness that made Joe's throat tight. "Not tonight, sweet girl. I need to help Mother gather our things. Father wants to get home before full dark to check on the livestock." It wasn't entirely a lie. Their milk cow had been acting poorly, and her father Nathaniel was worried about losing her. But it also wasn't entirely the truth. The truth was that Maggie couldn't bear to join the children's circle, couldn't face that final acknowledgement that she'd been relegated to the role of spinster aunt at 22, destined to live at the edges of other people's happiness. Abigail pouted but scampered off, and Maggie made her way to where her mother Patience was already folding their contribution to the refreshment table, a simple cake made with precious eggs and even more precious sugar. Her mother's eyes were kind but knowing as she glanced at Maggie's face. "Ready to head home, daughter?" "Yes, Mama." Patience Hewitt said nothing more, but she squeezed Maggie's hand briefly, a gesture of understanding that brought tears dangerously close to the surface. Her mother knew. Her mother had watched her own daughter be passed over year after year, and there was nothing she could do about it except offer the small comfort of presence and prayer. As Maggie helped gather their things, her father appeared from where he'd been talking crops with the other farmers. Nathaniel Hewitt was a weathered man, worn down by years of trying to coax a living from stubborn Wyoming soil, but his eyes were gentle as they rested on his eldest daughter. "Time to head out, Maggie girl. That cow won't wait on our socializing." The family made their way toward the door, collecting Ruth, Benjamin, and Abigail from various corners of the hall. They passed within 3 feet of where Joe stood in the doorway, and for one suspended moment, Maggie's eyes lifted and met his. It was brief, no more than a heartbeat, but in that instant, Joe saw everything he'd observed from across the room written plainly in her face. The loneliness, the resignation, the small, stubborn flicker of hope that refused to die no matter how many times it was disappointed. And Maggie, for her part, saw a tall, lean man with dark hair and eyes that held a sorrow that mirrored her own. She saw the way he gripped the doorframe as if needing its support, saw the careful way he held his right leg. She saw someone who understood what it meant to stand at the edges of life's dance. But the moment passed before either could speak, before either could acknowledge what had passed between them in that brief meeting of eyes. Nathaniel was already moving through the door, and Maggie followed her father out into the spring night, leaving Joe standing alone in the doorway with 1,000 unspoken words lodged in his throat. Now Joe watched the Hewitt wagon pull away, watched until the lamplight from the hall no longer illuminated the road, and they disappeared into the darkness beyond. Then he turned and slipped out himself, avoiding the main room, making his way to where his horse was tied with the others. The sounds of the social continued behind him, music and laughter and the simple joy of community, but Joe felt separated from it by more than just walls and distance. He felt separated by the unbridgeable gap between the people who were chosen and the people who watched from doorways. The ride back to the Patterson bunkhouse took the better part of an hour, and Joe spent it in silence, listening to the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves and the night sounds of the prairie, crickets and frogs and the distant call of a coyote. The sky above was thick with stars, so many stars that they seemed to crowd each other for space in the vast darkness. Joe had always found comfort in that sky, in the reminder that the God who'd set those stars in place knew him by name, knew the number of hairs on his head, knew every lonely night and every quiet heartbreak. "I know you see me, Lord," he said aloud, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the night. "I know you have a plan, even when I can't see it, but it's hard sometimes. It's hard to trust that you've got something good waiting when everything I can see suggests otherwise. Help me to be content. Help me to trust your timing. And if marriage isn't in your plan for me, help me to accept that with grace." It was a prayer he'd prayed 100 times before, maybe 1,000. Tonight it felt particularly hollow, weighted down by the memory of hazel eyes and a face that had learned too young how to hide disappointment. But Joe prayed it anyway, because faith wasn't about feeling. It was about choosing to trust, even when trust felt impossible. Back in the Hewitt wagon, Maggie sat squeezed between Ruth and Benjamin on the narrow bench, listening to Abigail chatter about all the dances she'd done and all the games the children had played. Her father drove in silence, his attention on the dark road ahead, and her mother hummed a hymn quietly, the melody barely audible above the creak of the wagon wheels. Maggie stared up at the same star-filled sky Joe was riding beneath, though neither knew they were sharing this moment of looking heavenward. She found the North Star, that faithful constant, and fixed her eyes on it as they bumped along the rutted road toward home. "Thank you, Lord, for what you have given me," she prayed silently, the words forming in her heart, even as tears pricked her eyes. "Thank you for my family, for health, for provision. Forgive me for wanting more. Forgive me for feeling sorry for myself. Help me to be content with the life you've given me, yet to find joy in serving others instead of longing for things that aren't meant to be mine. And if marriage isn't part of your plan, help me to accept it. Help me to trust that you know what's best, even when it hurts." Neither Maggie nor Joe could have known, as they prayed their separate prayers beneath the same vast sky, that God was already at work, answering in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Neither could have known that the brief meeting of eyes in a doorway was the beginning of something rather than the end. Neither could have known that sometimes God's greatest blessings come wrapped in ordinary moments, In glances exchanged and dances not yet danced, in the patient work of bringing two broken hearts together so they could learn to beat as one. The spring night settled deeper, wrapping Redemption Ridge and all its inhabitants in darkness. In the community hall, the social continued for another hour, the music and laughter eventually fading as families made their way home. In the Patterson bunkhouse, Joe lay on his narrow cot, reading his Bible by candlelight until exhaustion finally pulled him toward sleep. In the Hewitt homestead, Maggie changed out of her faded blue dress and hung it carefully in the wardrobe she shared with Ruth, then knelt beside her bed for evening prayers before climbing beneath the worn quilt her grandmother had made. Two people, alone in the darkness, each believing they knew exactly what their future held, each convinced that some joys were meant for others, not for them, each teaching themselves to be content with loneliness, to find peace in the margins, to accept that being overlooked was simply their lot in life, neither knowing that God was about to prove them both wonderfully, beautifully wrong. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the Hewitt homestead 3 months after the spring social, turning the Wyoming earth to dust and testing the faith of every settler who dared to claim this land as their own. It was the kind of heat that made breathing feel like work, that sent the chickens to hide in whatever shade they could find, that made even the simplest tasks feel Herculean. Maggie stood at the kitchen window, watching her father struggle with the plow in the distant wheat field, and felt the worry that had been her constant companion these past weeks settle even heavier in her chest. Something was wrong. She'd known it for days now, had seen it in the way her father moved more slowly each morning, in the way he pressed his hand to his chest when he thought no one was looking, in the way his face had gone gray beneath the sun-weathered tan. Nathaniel Hewitt was not a man to admit weakness, not a man to complain, but even he couldn't hide the toll that years of hard labor and harder disappointments had taken on his body. The homestead that had seemed so promising when they'd claimed it 5 years ago had proven to be as stubborn as the land itself, yielding just enough to keep them from starving, but never quite enough to get ahead. The wheat field was their last hope for a decent harvest this year. If they could bring it in before the early frost, if the price held steady, if they could get it to market without losing too much to waste, if. It seemed their whole life was built on ifs, on uncertainties, on prayers whispered into the night, and faith stretched thin as worn fabric. Maggie was just turning from the window to check on the bread rising in the bowl on the table when she heard it, a sound that would replay in her nightmares for weeks to come. A sharp crack, like thunder but not thunder, followed immediately by her mother's scream from where she'd been hanging laundry in the side yard. Maggie ran. She ran faster than she'd ever run in her life, her skirts tangling around her legs, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Ruth came running from the barn, Benjamin from where he'd been hauling water, and they all converged on the wheat field at the same moment to find their father lying motionless on the ground, the plow horse dancing nervously nearby, the leather traces snapped and dangling. Nathaniel's right arm was bent at an angle that made Maggie's stomach turn, and there was blood, so much blood, spreading across his shirt from where something, probably the plow blade, had caught him when the horse bolted. His face was chalk white, his breathing shallow and rapid, and when his eyes fluttered open, they were glazed with shock and pain. The next hours passed in a blur of desperate activity. They got Nathaniel into the house somehow, though Maggie could never quite remember the details. Benjamin rode hell for leather into town to fetch Doc Morrison, and Patience worked with Ruth and Maggie to stop the bleeding, to make their father as comfortable as possible while they waited for help to arrive. Abigail huddled in the corner, her 8-year-old face terrified, and Maggie found herself moving between caring for her father and comforting her baby sister, feeling torn in a dozen directions and adequate for none of them. Doc Morrison arrived as the sun was setting, his weathered face grave as he examined Nathaniel. The arm was broken badly, he confirmed, and the gash across his ribs was deep enough to need stitching. More concerning was the way Nathaniel's breathing sounded, labored and wet, suggesting the plow had caught more than just skin and bone. "He needs rest," the doctor said bluntly, washing his hands in the basin Ruth provided. "Complete rest, for at least 6 weeks. maybe more. No work, no lifting, nothing strenuous. That arm needs time to heal, and those ribs, if he punctured a lung, which I suspect he did, any exertion could kill him. The words fell like stones into the quiet kitchen. 6 weeks, maybe more. It might as well have been 6 years for all the difference it made. The wheat needed harvesting in the next month, and there was no way Patience and the children could manage it alone. Ruth was strong for 16, but she wasn't strong enough for that kind of labor. Benjamin was only 12, willing but lacking the size and strength needed for sustained field work. And Maggie, though she'd worked alongside her father since she was old enough to walk, knew her limitations. Between the three of them, they might manage a quarter of the field before the frost came, and that wasn't nearly enough. They were going to lose everything. The homestead, the harvest, years of back-breaking work. All of it would be for nothing because a plow horse had spooked at the wrong moment. Maggie felt the reality of it settle over her like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to draw breath. She stood at the kitchen window again after Doc Morrison left, staring out at that wheat field that represented their last hope, and felt despair rise up in a wave so powerful it threatened to pull her under. "Lord," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass, "I know you say you'll provide. I know you promise to care for your children, but I don't see how. I don't see any way through this. Please, if you're listening, we need a miracle. We need help. We need—" She didn't finish the prayer. She didn't know how to finish it. They needed so much, and she had so little faith left to offer. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let the tears come, silent and bitter. The tears of someone who'd tried so hard to be content with her lot, but who was discovering that contentment had limits. That there were some circumstances that couldn't be accepted with grace, some losses too great to bear with quiet dignity. The news of Nathaniel's accident spread through Redemption Ridge the way news always did in small communities. Quickly and with the kind of detail that suggested everyone had been there personally. By the next afternoon, neighbors started arriving with food and offers of help. Mrs. Patterson brought a ham. The Stones contributed fresh vegetables from their garden. Even the banker's wife, who rarely ventured out to the homesteads, sent over a basket of preserves and baked goods. But sympathy and food, however kindly meant, couldn't harvest a wheat field. The men of Redemption Ridge were all struggling with their own farms, their own harvests, on their own endless list of tasks that came with trying to survive in this unforgiving land. They offered what they could, an afternoon here, a morning there. But it wasn't enough, and everyone knew it. The Hewitts were going to lose their harvest, and possibly their homestead with it, and there wasn't anything anyone could do about it. It was on the third day after the accident, when Maggie was in town picking up medicine Doc Morrison had prescribed for her father's pain, that she heard about the offer. She was standing at the counter of Ferguson's Mercantile, counting out their precious coins to pay for the laudanum, when Joe Blackwood walked in. Maggie hadn't seen him since the spring social, though she'd thought of him more than once over the intervening months. She'd thought of those dark eyes that had held such understanding, of the way he'd looked at her as if he actually saw her. She told herself she was being foolish, reading meaning into a moment that had probably meant nothing to him. But now, seeing him again as he entered the Mercantile with his uneven gait, she felt her breath catch in a way she couldn't quite explain. Joe paused when he saw her, his hand still on the door handle, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then he nodded, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, and made his way to the counter. He waited patiently while Maggie completed her transaction, and she was acutely aware of his presence behind her, of the way Mr. Ferguson greeted him by name with genuine warmth. "Joe, heard you've been doing some fine work for the Simmons spread. They said you rebuilt their entire barn door system in half the time they expected." "Just carpentry, Mr. Ferguson. Nothing special." His voice was quiet, deeper than Maggie had imagined during those few times she'd let herself imagine it. There was a quality to it that matched his eyes, steady, calm, with an undercurrent of something that might have been loneliness or might have been simple reserve. Maggie gathered her package and turned to leave, intending to slip past Joe with perhaps another nod. Nothing more. But as she moved toward the door, she heard Mr. Ferguson say something that stopped her in her tracks. Shame about the Hewitt family. Nathaniel's accident couldn't have come at a worse time. That wheat field will go to waste now, and them barely hanging on as it is. Don't suppose you know anyone looking for work who might help them bring in the harvest? Maggie didn't turn around, but she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. It was one thing to know your family's desperate circumstances. It was another to hear them discussed publicly, as if you weren't standing right there. She was reaching for the door handle when Joe spoke again. I might be able to help with that. The words were spoken quietly, almost diffidently, but they echoed in Maggie's ears like a shout. She froze, her hand on the door, hardly daring to breathe. Behind her, Mr. Ferguson sounded surprised. You, Joe? But haven't you got your own work lined up? Thought you were headed up to the Morrison place next week for their fence repairs. I could delay that. The Morrisons aren't in any rush, and I know wheat harvesting. Did it for years before. He paused, and Maggie could hear the weight of things unspoken in that hesitation. Well, before I moved to ranch work. Well, that's mighty Christian of you, Joe. But I should tell you, the Hewitts, they don't have money to pay help. They can barely afford that medicine Miss Hewitt just bought. I know. So you'd be working for nothing? Another pause, longer this time. Maggie still hadn't moved, hardly dared to breathe. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the mercantile could hear it. I'd work for meals, Joe said finally. That's payment enough. No family should lose everything because of one accident. It isn't right. Maggie didn't remember leaving the mercantile. She didn't remember the walk to where her family's wagon was tied. Didn't remember climbing onto the seat. Didn't remember taking up the reins. Her mind was spinning, trying to process what she'd just heard, trying to understand why a man who barely knew her family would make such an offer. Charity, she told herself. It was simple Christian charity, the kind of neighborly help that frontier communities depended on. It meant nothing personal. It couldn't mean anything personal. But even as she told herself this, even as she guided the wagon out of town and onto the road that led home, she couldn't quite silence the small voice in her head that whispered different words. He saw you at the social. He watched you all night. And now he's offering to save your family's harvest for nothing more than meals. Maybe, just maybe, it means something after all. Joe arrived at the Hewitt homestead the next morning just after dawn, riding a sturdy bay horse and leading a pack mule loaded with his few possessions. Maggie was in the chicken coop gathering eggs when she heard the sound of hooves, and she emerged to find him sitting his horse in the yard, looking uncertainly at the house as if unsure of his welcome. Patience. Hewitt came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face showing the exhaustion of 3 days spent nursing her injured husband and worrying about their future. She looked at Joe, and Joe looked back at her, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then Joe carefully dismounted, favoring his right leg in a way that made his disability more obvious than it had been in the mercantile, and removed his hat. Mrs. Hewitt, ma'am, my name is Joe Blackwood. Mr. Ferguson at the mercantile mentioned you could use some help bringing in your wheat. I'm offering my labor in exchange for meals while I'm here. Nothing more. Patience's eyes filled with tears so suddenly that Maggie, watching from near the chicken coop, felt her own throat tighten in response. Her mother was not a woman who cried easily, but the relief on her face was palpable. Mr. Blackwood, we can't possibly, it's too much to ask. You're not asking, ma'am. I'm offering, and I'd count it a privilege to help if you'll let me. There was something in the way he said it, with such simple dignity and quiet sincerity, that made Maggie suddenly understand that this wasn't just about Christian charity or neighborly help. This was about a man who understood what it meant to be in desperate circumstances, who knew what it felt like to need help but be too proud to ask for it. This was about someone who'd been where they were now and who'd been saved by the kindness of strangers who saw his need and met it without making him feel diminished by the receiving. Patience must have seen it too, because she nodded and gestured toward the barn. "We have a small bunkhouse attached to the barn. It's not much, but it's clean and dry. You're welcome to it, Mr. Blackwood, and welcome to our table for as long as you're here." And just like that, Joe Blackwood became part of the Hewitt household, an arrangement that would last 6 weeks and change everything. The first few days were awkward in the way that new situations always are. Joe kept to himself mostly, rising before dawn to work in the wheat field, breaking only for the meals that Maggie and her mother prepared. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then his responses were brief and careful, as if he was afraid of overstepping some invisible boundary. Maggie found herself watching him from the kitchen window as he worked, noting the methodical way he approached the harvesting, the care he took with the equipment, or the way he pushed through the obvious pain his leg must have caused him without complaint. Benjamin attached himself to Joe almost immediately, following the quiet cowhand around like a puppy and peppering him with endless questions about ranching and horses and life on the frontier. Joe answered patiently, never seeming annoyed by the boy's constant presence, occasionally showing him how to do simple tasks or letting him help with the easier parts of the work. Watching them together, seeing the gentle way Joe treated her young brother, Maggie felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something dangerous, something she immediately tried to suppress. By the end of the first week, the awkwardness had begun to ease. Joe started joining them for the Bible reading that Patience insisted on before supper each evening, and his voice when he read the passages assigned to him was surprisingly rich and expressive, and suggesting a familiarity with Scripture that went beyond simple Sunday attendance. He knew the verses by heart in many cases, could quote references without having to look them up, and occasionally offered insights during their discussions that revealed a deep and thoughtful faith. Maggie found herself increasingly drawn into these evening conversations, forgetting her usual shyness in her eagerness to hear what Joe thought about various passages. They discovered they'd both been reading through the Psalms, both found particular comfort in the poems of David, both struggled with the same questions about suffering and God's purposes and how to maintain faith when circumstances seemed to contradict everything you believed about God's goodness. One evening, about 2 weeks into Joe's stay, they were discussing Psalm 139, and Joe read aloud the verses about being fearfully and wonderfully made, like about God knowing every day ordained for us before one of them came to be. His voice was quiet but firm as he read, and when he finished, he looked up to find Maggie watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Do you believe that?" she asked softly. "That we're fearfully and wonderfully made? Even when—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Even when the world suggests otherwise?" Joe was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the worn edges of his Bible. When he finally spoke, or his words were measured and careful, "I think believing it and feeling it are two different things, Miss Hewitt. I believe it because Scripture says it's true, and I trust Scripture more than I trust my feelings or the world's opinions. But feeling it, feeling like I'm wonderfully made when I look at my leg, or when I remember things people have said, or when I see whole men doing easily what costs me so much effort, that's harder. That's the daily battle, I suppose. Choosing to believe what God says about me instead of what I see in the mirror or hear in people's whispers." The honesty in his answer took Maggie's breath away. She'd expected platitudes, easy reassurances, the kind of spiritual talk that sounded good but meant little. Instead, Joe had offered her something real, something vulnerable, something that resonated with her own experience so deeply it almost hurt. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, that's exactly it. The daily battle. Choosing to believe we're valuable when everything in our experience suggests we're not." Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment, something passed between them that was more than sympathy, more than shared understanding. It was recognition, the bone-deep knowledge that they were the same, these two overlooked people, these two who'd learned to carry rejection like a familiar burden. They saw each other, truly saw each other, perhaps for the first time in either of their lives. Patience, watching from her place near the stove, said nothing, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she turned back to her dishes. She was a woman who believed in providence, who'd learned over years of hardship that God's timing was perfect even when it seemed impossibly slow. And she recognized providence when she saw it, even when her daughter was still too scared to hope. The days settled into a rhythm after that, a comfortable pattern of work and meals and evening devotions. Joe worked in the fields from dawn until dusk, and Maggie found herself working alongside him more and more often, helping to bind the sheaves, organizing the harvested wheat, learning the work that her father's injury had forced her to master. They talked as they worked, tentative at first but gradually more open, sharing bits and pieces of their stories like people carefully assembling a puzzle. Maggie learned about Joe's childhood, about the parents who died of fever when he was 14, leaving him orphaned and injured with nowhere to go. She learned about the ranch owner, a widower named Samuel Harrison, who'd taken Joe in and taught him both cattle work and scripture, who'd shown him what it meant to be a man of faith even when faith was all you had left. She learned about Penelope, though Joe only mentioned her once and never by name, referring only to someone I thought cared for me, who'd proven otherwise when his circumstances changed. Joe, in turn, learned about Maggie's dreams of maybe teaching school someday, about the way she'd taught herself to read better by studying her mother's few precious books, about her fierce love for her siblings and her quiet acceptance of a life that had offered her so little recognition or reward. He learned about the spring socials she'd attended year after year, about the slow death of hope that came from being overlooked so consistently that you started to believe you deserved to be overlooked. They didn't speak of attraction or affection. They were both too scarred, too careful, too afraid of misreading signs or hoping for something that couldn't be. But it was there nonetheless, growing quietly between them like wheat in a field, putting down roots so deep neither of them quite realized what was happening, until it was too late to pull them up. And then, in the 4th week of Joe's stay, Colt Henderson rode into the Hewitt yard. Maggie was at the pump filling water buckets when she heard the horse approaching, and she looked up to see the triple-crowned foreman sitting tall in his saddle, as handsome and confident as he'd been at the spring social. He dismounted with practiced ease and approached her with a smile that would have set her heart racing 6 months ago. "Miss Hewitt, I heard about your father's accident. Came to see how you all were managing, and if there's anything I can do to help." Maggie set down the bucket she'd been filling, aware suddenly of how she must look, dressed dusty and stained with wheat chaff, hair pulled back in a simple braid, face flushed from work and sun. She wiped her hands self-consciously on her apron and managed a polite smile. "That's kind of you, Mr. Henderson. Father is recovering slowly, but we're managing. Mr. Blackwood has been helping with the harvest." Colt's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Joe, and his gaze moved past Maggie to the wheat field where Joe was visible working, his distinctive gait obvious even from a distance. Something flickered across Colt's face. Was it disdain? Pity? Calculation? Before the pleasant smile returned. "Joe Blackwood. I know him. Works odd jobs here and there. Good man, I suppose, for what he is." The casual dismissal in Colt's tone made Maggie bristle, but he continued before she could respond. "But you really need more substantial help, Miss Hewitt. This homestead, in fact, well, my father has been meaning to speak with your father about a business proposition. We're looking to expand the Triple Crown's water access, and your creek runs right through land we'd like to acquire. We'd be willing to make a generous offer, something that might be a blessing given your family's current difficulties." The words were polite, the tone friendly, but something about the whole conversation made Maggie uncomfortable. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Maybe the way Colt's eyes assessed the homestead as he spoke, calculating its value like he was evaluating livestock. Maybe it was the implied threat behind the friendly offer, the suggestion that selling might be their only option. "I'll mention it to Father when he's feeling stronger," she said carefully. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Henderson." But Colt wasn't quite finished. He stepped closer, close enough that Maggie had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and his voice dropped to something more intimate. "You know, Miss Hewitt, I've been thinking about you since the spring social, wondering why I didn't ask you to dance that night. It was an oversight I'd like to correct. Would you consider allowing me to call on you? I think we might find we suit each other quite well." The words should have thrilled her. Here was exactly what she'd longed for at that spring social: the attention of a handsome, prosperous man, the validation of being chosen, the promise of security and social standing. Colt Henderson represented everything she'd thought she wanted, everything she'd believed was forever out of her reach. But as she looked up at his handsome face, as she heard his smooth words and felt his calculated charm, all Maggie could think about was Joe. Joe working quietly in the wheat field, never asking for recognition or reward. Joe reading scripture with such depth of understanding at their evening devotions. Joe showing Benjamin how to mend a bridle with patient hands. Joe looking at her across the supper table as if she was someone worth seeing, worth knowing, worth caring about. "I'm flattered, Mr. Henderson," she heard herself say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "But I don't think that would be appropriate. Thank you for the offer, though." Colt's smile never wavered, but something cold flashed in his eyes, something that made Maggie take an instinctive step backward. "Well, think about it, Miss Hewitt. Sometimes the practical choice is the wise choice, especially for families in difficult circumstances. I'll be back in a few days to speak with your father about that land proposition. Perhaps you'll have reconsidered by then." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Maggie standing by the pump with her heart pounding and her thoughts in turmoil. She didn't notice Joe had stopped working and was watching from the wheat field, his face unreadable from that distance. She didn't see the way his hands tightened on the scythe he was holding, or the way something that might have been hope died in his eyes as he watched Colt Henderson ride away. That evening, the atmosphere at supper was strained. Joe was even quieter than usual, responding to questions with single words, barely touching his food. Benjamin chattered to fill the silence, but even he eventually subsided into confused quiet. Maggie found herself unable to meet Joe's eyes, unsure what she'd see there if she did. After the meal, after the dishes were washed and the Bible reading completed, Joe excused himself early and retreated to the bunkhouse. Maggie stood at the kitchen window and watched the lamplight flickering in that small structure, and felt a loneliness so acute it took her breath away. She'd refused Colt, had sent him away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd somehow lost something today anyway, something precious and fragile that she hadn't even known she had until it was gone. In the bunkhouse, Joe sat on his narrow cot with his Bible open on his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was staring at the wall, wrestling with emotions he'd tried so hard to keep buried. He'd been a fool, he told himself. A fool to think that working alongside Maggie, talking with her, sharing meals and scripture with her meant anything more than simple gratitude. She was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Of course she'd choose someone like Colt Henderson over someone like him. Of course she'd choose security and handsomeness and wholeness over a broken-down ranch hand who owned nothing but a horse and a Bible. He'd let himself hope, and that had been his mistake. He'd let himself imagine, just for a moment, that maybe God had brought him to this homestead for more than just harvesting wheat. He'd let himself wonder if maybe, just maybe, he'd found in Maggie Hewitt someone who could see past his limitations to the man beneath. But hope, Joe had learned long ago, was dangerous for men like him. Hope led to heartbreak. Better to finish the harvest, collect his horse, and move on to the next job, the next place, on the next temporary situation that would never become permanent because nothing ever did for people like him. "Your will, Lord," he prayed quietly, the words familiar but tonight tasting bitter. "Not mine, but yours. If this was just about the harvest, about helping a family in need, then let me finish the work and move on with grace. But if you had something else in mind, if I misread your leading, help me to accept that too. Help me to trust that you know what's best even when I can't see it, even when it hurts." Two people, separated by the width of a yard and the weight of old wounds, each alone with their thoughts and fears and half-acknowledged longings. Each convinced they knew how this story would end. Each certain that some blessings were meant for other people, that some hopes were foolish to hold on to, that some prayers went unanswered, not because God didn't hear, but because the answer was simply no. Neither knowing that the story was far from over, neither seeing that God was still at work, still weaving threads together in patterns they couldn't yet perceive, still writing a narrative of redemption and restoration that would require them both to risk everything they'd been protecting for so long. The harvest continued, and the days grew shorter, and autumn began to paint the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and crimson. And in the space between two human hearts, hope, fragile, persistent, on refusing to die no matter how much they tried to bury it, continued to grow. The morning after Colt Henderson's visit dawned cold and gray, with the kind of penetrating chill that signaled autumn's firm arrival and winter's approach on its heels. Maggie woke before dawn, as had become her habit during the harvest weeks, and lay in the bed she shared with Ruth, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand the knot of emotions tangled in her chest. She should have felt triumphant. She'd refused Colt Henderson, had chosen integrity over convenience, faith over pragmatism. Instead, she felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of her during that conversation by the pump. The real problem, the thing she couldn't quite face in the honest light of morning, was that refusing Colt had made her realize something she'd been trying very hard not to acknowledge. She'd refused him, not because of who he was, but because of who he wasn't. She'd refused him because when he'd stood close and spoken his smooth words, all she could think about was Joe Blackwood reading psalms in his quiet, deep voice. She'd refused him because his calculated charm felt hollow compared to Joe's genuine kindness. She'd refused him because somewhere in the past 4 weeks, while she'd been carefully not hoping, carefully not imagining, carefully protecting her heart, she'd gone and fallen in love with a broken-down ranch hand who would be leaving as soon as the harvest was complete. The realization terrified her. Loving someone meant vulnerability, meant risk, meant opening yourself to the kind of rejection she'd spent years learning to avoid. And loving Joe specifically seemed like the height of foolishness. What did she have to offer a man like him? She was a farmer's daughter with no prospects, no beauty, nothing but work-roughened hands, and a heart that had been rejected so many times it bore scars like old rope burns. Why would he choose her when he could choose anyone? Why would he stay when staying meant tying himself to a struggling homestead and a woman the world had already deemed not worth having? But the heart, Maggie was discovering, didn't care much for logic or self-protection. The heart wanted what it wanted, and hers wanted Joe Blackwood with an intensity that shocked her. She rose and dressed quickly, helping Ruth with her hair and then heading to the kitchen to start breakfast. Her mother was already there, kneading dough for the morning biscuits, and she looked up when Maggie entered with eyes that saw too much. "You're troubled, daughter." It wasn't a question. Patience Hewitt knew her children the way she knew the rhythms of her own heartbeat, and she could read Maggie's moods in the set of her shoulders and the shadows under her eyes. "I'm fine, Mama. I'm just tired from the harvest work." Maggie Louise. Her mother's hands stilled in the dough, and she fixed her eldest daughter with a look that demanded honesty. "I've lived long enough to know the difference between tired and troubled. Talk to me." And because Maggie was tired, and because she was troubled, and because sometimes you just needed your mother, the words came spilling out. She told Patience about Colt's visit, about his offer to court her, about refusing him. She told her about the way Joe had been distant at supper, about the feeling that something precious and fragile had broken. She didn't say the words, "I love him." She couldn't quite bring herself to speak them aloud, but they hung in the air between mother and daughter anyway, as clear as if she'd shouted them. Patience listened without interrupting, her hands resuming their work in the dough, her face thoughtful. When Maggie finally fell silent, her mother was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Your father and I weren't rich when we married," she said finally, her voice soft with memory. "We had nothing but a wagon, 2 horses, and enough supplies to last us maybe 3 months if we were careful. Everyone told us we were fools to head west, that we'd never make it, that the frontier was no place for people with more faith than sense. But your father looked at me one evening, standing by that wagon in the fading light, and he said, 'Patience, I can't promise you ease or comfort. I can't promise you a fine house or pretty dresses, but I can promise you I'll love you with everything I have, and I'll work until my hands bleed to build us a life. Is that enough?" And I said yes, because it was enough. Because love and faithfulness and a shared purpose were worth more than all the comfort and security in the world. She shaped the dough into biscuits with practiced efficiency, placing them in the pan before continuing. "I'm not saying comfort and security don't matter. I'm not saying it's wrong to want those things. But I am saying that choosing a man for his prospects rather than his character is building your house on sand instead of stone. And when the storms come, and they always come, daughter, sand won't hold." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "But what if he doesn't want me, Mama? What if I'm just reading too much into kindness? What if I tell him how I feel and he—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that had haunted her for years. What if she offered her heart and had it rejected? What if she risked everything and lost? "Then you'll survive it," Patience said firmly, "just like you've survived every other disappointment life has handed you. But Maggie, what if you don't risk it? What if you let fear keep you silent and he leaves thinking you don't care? What if you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been if you just had the courage to speak?" The words settled over Maggie like a weight and a challenge. Her mother was right. Of course her mother was right. But knowing something intellectually and having the courage to act on it were two very different things. The gap between recognizing truth and embodying it was as wide as the Wyoming sky. She was saved from having to respond by Benjamin bursting through the door, his young face flushed with excitement and alarm in equal measure. "Mama! Maggie! Mr. Blackwood says to tell you he's found something wrong with Father's plow, something that might have caused the accident. He wants Father to come look if he's able." They found Joe in the barn, standing beside the plow that had nearly killed Nathaniel Hewitt, and his face grave and his hands holding something that glinted in the morning light filtering through the barn doors. Nathaniel had insisted on being helped out to see what Joe had discovered, and he stood now leaning heavily on Ruth, his face still pale but his eyes sharp with interest. "What is it, Mr. Blackwood?" Nathaniel asked, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Joe held up the leather trace, the connecting strap between the horse and the plow. But this wasn't torn or worn leather. This was leather that had been deliberately cut, sliced nearly through so that only a thin strip remained intact. The cut was clean and precise, positioned exactly where it would create maximum damage when the leather finally gave way under strain. "This wasn't an accident, Mr. Hewitt," Joe said quietly. "Someone sabotaged your equipment. When your horse pulled against the plow, this cut section gave way, and the sudden release caused the horse to bolt. That's what threw you into the plow blade." The implications of Joe's words settled over them all like a cold wind. This wasn't bad luck or a worn piece of equipment. This was deliberate, malicious, intended to cause harm. Someone had wanted Nathaniel Hewitt injured, or worse. Who would do such a thing? Patience whispered, her hand going to her throat. But even as she asked, Maggie knew. She knew with a certainty that made her stomach turn. She remembered Colt Henderson's words about his father wanting their land for water access. She remembered the calculation in his eyes as he'd assessed their homestead. She remembered his parting words. Sometimes the practical choice is the wise choice, especially for families in difficult circumstances. "The Triple Crown," Nathaniel said grimly, coming to the same conclusion. "They've been after our water rights for 2 years, made offer after offer, each one less generous than the last. When I refused them all, they said they'd find another way. I didn't think—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I didn't think they'd stoop to attempted murder." Joe carefully set down the cut trace, his face harder than Maggie had ever seen it. "This needs to be reported to the sheriff. This is a crime, Mr. Hewitt, and whoever did it needs to answer for it." "And say what?" Nathaniel's voice was bitter with the knowledge of frontier justice, or the lack thereof. "The Hendersons own half this county, including the sheriff's brother-in-law. You think anyone's going to take the word of a struggling homesteader against the most powerful ranching family in the territory? They'll claim it was coincidence, or that I did it myself for sympathy, or any of a dozen other explanations that will make me look foolish for even suggesting foul play. So we do nothing? Ruth's voice shook with anger. We just let them get away with nearly killing Father? We be smart, Joe said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone turn to look at him. We finish this harvest. We get your wheat to market. We make sure the Hewitts are secure enough that the Triple Crown can't pressure you into selling. And then... He paused, and something fierce flashed in his dark eyes. Then we make sure the truth comes out in a way they can't deny or suppress. Over the next 3 days, as they worked to bring in the last of the wheat, Joe proved to be as strategic as he was steady. He quietly spread word through the community about what he'd found, careful to present it as concern rather than accusation, letting people draw their own conclusions. He made sure Doc Morrison saw the cut trace, getting the doctor's professional opinion documented. He even convinced the pastor, William Garrett, to come out and examine the evidence, knowing that the pastor's testimony carried weight that a simple ranch hand's never would. Meanwhile, Colt Henderson returned as promised, so arriving with his father, Harrison Henderson, the patriarch of the Triple Crown Ranch. Harrison was everything Colt would become in 30 years, handsome still, but with a hardness around his eyes and mouth that suggested a man who'd gotten his way too often and for too long. He sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, and when he spoke, his voice carried the casual arrogance of someone who'd never seriously considered that the world might tell him no. Nathaniel, Harrison said, not bothering with pleasantries or concern about the injured man's health. I'll get straight to it. I'm prepared to offer you $300 for your land and water rights. It's more than fair, more than you'd get from anyone else. Your harvest looks poor, your equipment is failing, and you're in no condition to work this land properly. Take the money, relocate somewhere easier, and save yourself years of struggle. $300. It was an insult, on barely enough to buy passage back east and set up a modest shop in some small town. It was also, Maggie realized with cold clarity, exactly what the Hendersons had planned from the start. Injure Nathaniel, wait for the family to become desperate, then swoop in with an offer that looked generous to outsiders but was really just theft with a veneer of legality. Nathaniel, still weak but with a spine of steel that no injury could bend, straightened as much as his broken ribs would allow. My land is not for sale, Harrison. Not for 300, not for 3,000. My family worked this claim, built this homestead with our own hands, and we're not leaving because you want our water. Harrison's face darkened, and beside him, Colt shifted in his saddle with barely concealed anger. You're being foolish, Nathaniel. You can't work this land in your condition. You'll lose everything anyway come winter. I'm offering you a way out with dignity. What's undignified, Joe said quietly from where he stood near the barn, is sabotaging a man's equipment and then offering to buy his land when he's too injured to defend it. Every eye turned to Joe, and Harrison's face went dangerously red. That's a serious accusation, Cowboy. You got any proof? I've got a cut leather trace that Doc Morrison and Pastor Garrett have both examined and documented. I've got witness testimony about your repeated attempts to acquire this land. I've got a timeline that shows the accident happened right when it would do maximum damage to the Hewitts' harvest. And I've got enough people in Redemption Ridge asking questions now that even Sheriff Barnes is going to have to investigate, brother-in-law or not. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Harrison stared at Joe with eyes that promised retribution. But there was also wariness there now, the recognition that his carefully planned scheme had been exposed before it could be completed. Colt looked between his father and Joe, his handsome face twisting with fury. You're nothing but a crippled ranch hand, Colt spat at Joe, the words dripping with contempt. Who's going to believe anything you say? You're nobody, nothing. You've got no property, no prospects, no future. You're just... That's enough. Maggie's voice cut through Colt's tirade like a blade, and she stepped forward to stand beside Joe, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Mr. Blackwood is worth 10 of you, Colt Henderson. He's shown more integrity and character in 6 weeks than you've shown in your entire life. He works hard, treats people with respect, and doesn't need to tear others down to build himself up. Those are the qualities that matter, not property or prospects or appearances. And if you can't see that, then you're the one who's nothing." The words rang out across the yard, carrying to where neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the raised voices and the sense of confrontation. Maggie heard murmurs of agreement, saw heads nodding, felt the community's support solidifying around her family and around Joe. The Hendersons had overplayed their hand, and now they were facing the consequences. Harrison recognized it too. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage, but he was smart enough to know when to retreat. "This isn't over, Nathaniel. Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Pastor Garrett said, stepping forward from where he'd been standing with the gathering crowd. "I'll be mentioning this incident in my sermon on Sunday, Harrison. I'll be talking about the importance of honest dealing, of treating neighbors with respect, of living out our faith in practical ways. I expect the whole county will be there to hear it. I also expect the sheriff will want to examine that cut trace and ask some difficult questions. So, unless you want to face formal charges, I suggest you accept that the Hewitt land is not for sale and will never be for sale to you." Harrison and Colt left without another word, but the looks they shot at Joe and Maggie promised that while this battle was over, they'd made powerful enemies. Maggie found herself shaking as the adrenaline drained away, and suddenly Joe's hand was there, steady and warm, taking hers and holding it firmly. "You were incredibly brave," he said quietly, for her ears only. "Thank you for defending me. No one's ever—" His voice caught, and he didn't finish the sentence, but Maggie understood. No one had ever stood up for him like that before. No one had ever declared his worth publicly, had chosen to align themselves with him despite the cost. "I meant every word," she whispered back, looking up into those dark eyes that had watched her all night at a spring social that felt like a lifetime ago. Every single word. Their hands remained clasped, and around them, the neighbors began to disperse, talking among themselves about what they'd witnessed, about the Hendersons' fall from grace, about the quiet ranch hand who'd saved the Hewitt family in more ways than one. But Maggie barely noticed. She was too focused on Joe, on the way he was looking at her now with something that might have been hope, might have been wonder, might have been the reflection of everything she was feeling. "Miss Hewitt," he said formally, though his thumb was tracing circles on the back of her hand in a way that was anything but formal. "Maggie, I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you before I lose my courage. I came here to help with a harvest, but I'm leaving with my heart full of things I never expected to feel. I'm leaving in love with a woman who saw me when I thought I was invisible, who chose me when I thought I was unchosen, who stood beside me when standing beside me meant making enemies of powerful people. I don't have much to offer. I've got a horse, a worn Bible, and hands willing to work until they bleed. But if that's enough, if you could possibly see your way to considering a future with someone like me, I'd count it the greatest blessing of my life." Maggie felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Joe Blackwood, I watched you at the spring social standing in that doorway, and I wondered what it would be like to be seen the way you were looking at people, really seen, truly seen. Then you came here and you saw me, saw my family, saw our need and met it without making us feel diminished. You've shown me what real love looks like, what godly character means, what it is to be chosen by someone who chooses with their whole heart. If you're asking whether that's enough, the answer is yes. It's more than enough. It's everything." Joe pulled her close, mindless of the neighbors still lingering, mindless of propriety, mindless of everything except the miracle of holding someone who loved him not despite his brokenness, but including it, someone who saw his limp and his scars and his limitations and chose him anyway. Maggie buried her face in his shirt and held on tight, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and feeling safe and seen and chosen in a way she'd never experienced before. "I need to do this properly," Joe said after a long moment, pulling back enough to look at her but not letting go. "I need to ask your father's permission. I need to court you the right way. Give us time to be sure. I need—" "Yes to all of it," Maggie interrupted, laughing through her tears. Yes to proper courtship. Yes to asking Father. Yes to taking time. Yes, yes, yes to whatever you're about to say. From the porch, Patience watched her daughter in the quiet cowhand and felt her own tears of gratitude. She'd prayed for this, had asked God to send someone who would see Maggie's worth, and here he was, not the prosperous, handsome man the world might have chosen, but exactly the right man nonetheless. God's timing, Patience reflected, was always perfect, even when it seemed impossibly slow. And his choice of partners for his children was always better than anything they might have chosen for themselves. The autumn passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Joe officially asked Nathaniel for permission to court Maggie, and Nathaniel, who'd watched Joe save not only his harvest but his family's entire future, gave his blessing with joy. The courtship was proper and old-fashioned, with chaperoned buggy rides and carefully supervised visits, but it was also deeply romantic in the way that real love always is. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, and they read scripture together and prayed together and learned the rhythms of each other's faith. They worked side by side, finishing the harvest preparations, and were at the market when the wheat sold for better than expected prices, ensuring the Hewitts' security for another year. Joe worked odd jobs around Redemption Ridge, never staying far from town, always finding reasons to stop by the Hewitt homestead. He became part of the family's rhythm, expected at Sunday dinners, welcomed at evening devotions, as much a fixture as the furniture. Benjamin followed him everywhere, learning everything Joe could teach about horses and ranching, and what it meant to be a man of character. Ruth treated him like the older brother she'd never had. Even young Abigail, with a child's uncomplicated affection, declared that Mr. Joe was her favorite person after Mama and Papa. As winter approached and the first snows began to dust the Wyoming landscape, Joe knew it was time. He'd saved every penny from his odd jobs, had been squirreling away money for weeks, and finally had enough for what he needed. He rode into Cheyenne on a cold December morning and returned that evening with a small box in his pocket and a heart full of hope and terror in equal measure. He waited until Sunday dinner, until the family was gathered around the table in the warm glow of lamplight, until the meal was finished and the dishes cleared. Then, with hands that shook only slightly, he pulled out the box and got down on his good knee in front of Maggie's chair. "Margaret Louise Hewitt," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "6 months ago, I watched you at a dance and thought you were the loneliest person I'd ever seen. I recognized you because I was the same, overlooked, passed by, learning to make peace with a life lived in the margins. But God had different plans than either of us imagined. He brought me here to your family's homestead, and in the process of helping with a harvest, I harvested something far more precious. I harvested hope. I harvested joy. I harvested the courage to believe that someone like you might love someone like me." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, nothing fancy but earned through honest labor, and offered, with a full heart, "I can't promise you wealth or ease. I can't promise you a life without struggle or hardship. But I can promise you, I'll love you with everything I am for as long as God gives me breath. I can promise you I'll work until my hands bleed to build us a good life. I can promise you I'll honor God and cherish you, and choose you every single day for the rest of my life. Will you marry me, Maggie? Will you take this broken-down ranch hand and let him spend forever showing you how wonderful you are?" Maggie was crying too hard to speak, so she just nodded and held out her hand. Joe slipped the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. And then he was standing and she was in his arms, and the whole family was cheering and crying and thanking God for answered prayers. They married in June of 1883, on a warm Sunday morning at Redemption Ridge's small church. Maggie wore a new dress, blue calico like her old one, but this one sewn by the women of the community as their gift to the bride. Joe wore his Sunday best, brushed and pressed, with a new shirt his almost mother-in-law Patience had made specially. Pastor Garrett performed the ceremony, speaking about covenant and commitment and Christ at the center of marriage, about how God orchestrates meetings and wastes no suffering, about how his timing is always perfect even when we can't see it. When Joe and Maggie exchanged their vows, speaking the old words about having and holding for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death parted them. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Everyone present had watched this story unfold, had seen two overlooked people find each other, had witnessed the way God could take rejection and loneliness and turn them into something beautiful and redemptive. The wedding breakfast was held in the community hall where they'd first not met, and as the celebration continued into the afternoon, the fiddles eventually started playing dance music. When the first waltz began, Joe led Maggie onto the floor, and for once, his limp didn't matter. For once, the world didn't seem to be watching and judging. For once, it was just the two of them, moving slowly and awkwardly and beautifully to music that seemed written just for them. "I love you, Mrs. Blackwood," Joe whispered against her hair as they turned. "I love you, Mr. Blackwood," Maggie whispered back, feeling joy so complete it almost hurt. "Thank you for watching me that night. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for standing up for me when it cost you something to do it. Thank you for choosing me when you had every reason to choose someone else. Thank you for being brave enough to hope when hope felt foolish." They danced until the music stopped, and then they danced to one more song, and then Joe led Maggie outside where their wagon waited, loaded with everything they owned and ready to take them to their new life together. Joe had used his savings and a loan from the bank, secured by the character testimonies of half the town, to purchase a small piece of land not far from the Hewitt homestead. It wasn't much, just enough acres for a modest ranch and a small cabin that needed work, but it was theirs, earned honestly and started with faith. The years that followed were not always easy. The frontier was never easy, and building a life from nothing required every ounce of strength and faith they possessed. There were hard winters when they wondered if they'd make it through. There were dry summers when the grass failed, and they had to sell livestock they couldn't afford to feed. There were moments of doubt and fear and exhaustion so complete that prayer was all they had left. But through it all, they had each other. They had morning devotions read together by lamplight. They had evening talks where they shared their days and their dreams. They had the simple joy of working side by side toward a shared goal. They had a love built on the firm foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection and faith in a God who saw them both and called them both beloved. In the late fall of 1884, Maggie discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled them with joy and terror in equal measure. They had so little, and babies needed so much, but they prayed and trusted and prepared as best they could, and when their daughter was born on a snowy November evening, they named her Mercy Joy Blackwood. Mercy for the grace God had shown them, and joy for what this child represented in their lives. Joe wept when he held his daughter for the first time, this tiny, perfect creature that he and Maggie had created together, this living proof that God could take two broken people and make something whole and beautiful from their union. And Maggie watched her husband cradle their baby with infinite gentleness and felt her heart expand with love she hadn't known was possible. Over the next 10 years, 3 more children joined the Blackwood family. Nathan James arrived in 1887, named for Maggie's father and for Joe's middle name. Hope Elizabeth came in 1890, another daughter whose birth reminded them of all the times they'd hoped when hope seemed foolish. And finally, Isaac Daniel completed their family in 1893, a surprise blessing when they'd thought their family was complete. The Blackwood Ranch prospered, not into wealth, but into solid, steady security. Joe proved to be as good a rancher as he was a ranch hand, and his reputation for honest dealing and fair prices meant he never lacked for buyers. Maggie discovered she had a gift for teaching, and she spent winter months tutoring the children of surrounding homesteads, bringing in extra income and fulfilling the dream she'd carried since she was young. But more than their material success, the Blackwoods became known throughout Redemption Ridge for their faith and their hospitality. Their small cabin was always open to those in need. They took in orphaned children when the circuit preacher couldn't find homes for them. They helped young couples just starting out, remembering their own struggles and wanting to ease someone else's path. They were living proof that God could take the overlooked and the rejected and use them to bless entire communities. In the spring of 1895, 13 years after that first social where nobody had asked Maggie to dance, the Blackwood family attended the annual spring social together. Mercy was 10 now, a bright, compassionate girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's kind heart. Nathan was 7, Benjamin's shadow and namesake, learning ranching at his uncle's knee. Hope was 5, already showing signs of her mother's teaching gift, and Isaac, at 2, was being passed between relatives who all wanted to cuddle the youngest Blackwood. As the dancing started, Maggie watched from her seat near the refreshment table, the same spot she'd stood 13 years ago, but everything was different now. She wasn't watching alone, hoping someone would notice her. She was surrounded by family and friends, her hand clasped in Joe's, her heart full to overflowing with contentment and joy. Now, when the first waltz began, Joe stood and offered her his hand with a bow that was only slightly mocking. "Mrs. Blackwood, may I have this dance?" "You may, Mr. Blackwood," Maggie said, laughing, taking his hand and letting him lead her onto the floor. They danced as they always did. Slowly, awkwardly, him limping and her following his uneven rhythm, both of them knowing they looked nothing like the graceful couple swirling around them. But they didn't care. They'd never cared. Because they'd learned long ago that the opinion that mattered wasn't the world's but God's, and he'd called them fearfully and wonderfully made, beloved and chosen, exactly who he'd meant them to be. As they turned across the floor, Maggie caught sight of a young woman standing alone near the back wall, wearing a faded dress and trying to look content despite the loneliness written plainly on her face. And near the doorway, half hidden by shadows, stood a young man watching that same woman with eyes full of longing and fear. Maggie squeezed Joe's hand, drawing his attention to what she'd seen, and they shared a knowing smile. After the dance ended, they made their way over to the young couple, separately approaching each, gently encouraging the young man to be brave, quietly telling the young woman that she was worth more than she knew, planting seeds of hope in hearts that had learned too well how to protect themselves from disappointment. Later that evening, as the Blackwood family made their way home in their wagon, bigger now, more comfortable but still rattling along the same rutted roads, Mercy asked her parents to tell again how they met. "There was a dance," Maggie began, Joe's arm around her shoulders, "where nobody asked me to dance. I stood against the wall all evening, feeling invisible and forgotten. But what I didn't know was that one cowboy was watching me all night. I saw her," Joe continued, his voice warm with memory, "and I recognized her because she was just like me, someone the world had overlooked but who was precious beyond measure. I wanted to ask her to dance, but I was too scared. I let fear keep me silent. But God had other plans," Maggie said softly. "He brought your papa to our homestead to help with a harvest, and in the process, we harvested something far more valuable than wheat. We harvested hope and love and faith that God sees us even when no one else does." "The lesson," Joe said, addressing all 4 of his children, "is this: the world may overlook you, people may pass you by, you may stand at 100 dances and never be asked, but that doesn't mean you're not valuable. That doesn't mean you're not seen. God sees you. He knows you. He has plans for you that are good and beautiful and worth waiting for. Don't let rejection make you bitter. Don't let loneliness convince you that you're not enough. Wait on God's timing, hold fast to your faith, and trust that He's writing a better story than you could ever write for yourself." "And be brave," Maggie added, smiling at her husband. "When the time comes, be brave enough to hope, brave enough to risk your heart, brave enough to choose love even when love seems foolish. Because the greatest blessings often come wrapped in the courage to trust God more than you trust your fears." The wagon rolled on through the Wyoming night, carrying a family that shouldn't have existed if the world had had its way. A crippled ranch hand and an overlooked farmer's daughter, their 4 beloved children, and a love story that had started with watching and waiting and hoping against hope that somewhere, someone saw them and thought them worth choosing. Above them, the same stars Joe and Maggie had prayed beneath 13 years ago shone down, constant and faithful, reminders of a God who numbered those stars and knew them by name, who cared for sparrows and wildflowers and overlooked people dancing awkwardly at frontier socials. A God who wasted nothing, who used everything, who could take the loneliest hearts and weave them into stories of redemption so beautiful they took your breath away. Nobody had asked her to dance, but one cowboy had watched her all night. And in that watching, in that seeing, in that patient work of a God who orchestrates meetings and timing and the bringing together of two souls who needed each other, a miracle had begun. A miracle that was still unfolding, still growing, still bearing fruit in the lives of everyone it touched. The Blackwood wagon disappeared into the darkness, heading home, heading toward whatever tomorrow might bring. But whatever came, hard times or easy, struggle or blessing, joy or sorrow, they would face it together, chosen, beloved, seen by each other and by the God who'd brought them together against all odds. And that, in the end, was more than enough. It was everything. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that they are seen, valued, and loved exactly as they are. Remember, God's timing is always perfect, His plans are always good, and you are never overlooked in His eyes. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. I love hearing how these stories impact you. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a story of faith, hope, and redemptive love. God bless you all.